The New York Times has released an editorial laying out the fact that they will now refer to enhanced interrogation techniques as torture when they believe that they're actually torture. Now, for a very long time, as revelations about what the CIA has gotten up to in black sites and even close to home in terms of how they get information from suspects have come out, this entire time they have refused to use the word torture. We're going to read a little bit from that editorial explaining why they decided to make this shift. They said, when the first revelations emerged a decade ago, the situation was murky. The details about what the CIA did in its interrogation rooms were vague. The word torture had a specialized legal meaning as well as a plain English one. The Times described what we knew of the program but avoided a label that was still in dispute, instead using terms like harsh or brutal interrogation methods. But they go on to say that they now believe that they can move past that. It's pretty clear what has been going on now that we have much more information being released by the CIA. So from now on, the Times will use the word torture to describe incidents in which we know for sure that interrogators inflicted pain on a prisoner in an effort to get information. And we know that that has been the case many, many times, sometimes hundreds of times with the same prisoner or suspect.
I mean, what a frickin' embarrassment for the paper of record of the United States of America. It's a shameful day, and that's a shameful editorial. And Dean, I can't remember, Baquet, is that how we say it? I think
Baquet.
I think it's Baquet. Sure. But it's funny, I knew how to pronounce his name when he got the job a month ago, and 2 months ago, I've completely forgotten. Like, you know, every other news organization figured this out. You got handled by the Bush administration prior to the war, played an enormous role in this complete mayhem that is now happening. I mean, like, we as the United States bear responsibility for the Yazidis on that mountain for creating this predictable and impossible dynamic. And you guys got played. You should have some sense that you were played. And they sort of continued to get played because it was so offensive to them that they got played, that they were so careful each and every step of the way. Do your job. Report. You failed. It was a giant failure. It's one of the biggest failures of serious American journalism in my lifetime. And maybe ever, or certainly in the last 50 years, that we have dropped the ball like this. And now, what do you want, a pat on the back? You don't get a pat on the back. Nobody should read you. Everyone associated with it, who really was associated with it, should have lost their jobs.
I don't know if I would call this the biggest failure of American journalism in our lifetime, but I think that the reason—
What's bigger?
I think the reason that it feels that way is because there was a certain amount of trust that was placed into this paper that was beyond anything that we see in
general,
media.
The journalism failure in the run-up post 9/11 is the biggest failure, and I think that's going to be tough to beat.
Yeah, perhaps.
And the New York Times, because the New York Times played a critical role in that failure, maybe the leading role. Certainly, you can't ignore what happened on television.
I'm not sure if not calling torture.
No. I mean, I'm doing the whole thing that at the very least, what should be here is, man, here's the editorial we're going to write. Here are the amazing things that we did wrong.
Yeah.
And one of them was
And
torture.
that's not going to happen. Nope. I mean, it's not going to happen at all.
You could almost sort of forgive them, I guess, if after 9/11 we had devised totally brand new interrogation techniques that had never been used before, and so it wasn't clear historically if they should be called torture or not. But the exact techniques that the CIA used, these are things that when they had been used against U.S. forces in previous conflicts around the world, we called them torture. We tried and imprisoned people for using those techniques in war. And then suddenly when we wanted to use them, when we thought it would generate actionable intelligence, it was suddenly not torture anymore. The New York, I understand why the administration might be willing to ignore history in that way, but the Times should not have. They knew what it was back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and they should have reported on that.
This just harkens to any place where there is no free press. I mean, that's what this feels like. This feels like a state-run newspaper at this point. When they're going to wait until the president himself makes a comment before they look at that as if it's truth, there is no reporting being done there.
And a giant Senate intelligence report.
Yeah, exactly. It's 2014.
Exactly.
And is this the Vox piece that we have here says that Baquet still won't admit the paper made a mistake by denying the obvious. Like, like you goofed it. By the way, it's not even on you. You weren't even there. So you had a freebie.
That's just such like an American thing to do. Is just to no apologies, just move forward. But then it's like, how are we supposed to trust you as a legitimate source for news after this?
You know who called it torture? McClatchy. And they hammered the New York Times day after day after day after day after day, month after month after month, year after year.
McClatchy did a terrific job in covering it, and there's still some great journalism in America. In this case, the saying of better late than never does not apply, because the whole problem with this is twofold. One is, as all these guys have pointed out, we expect better from the New York Times. Television was a disaster, right? Everybody was cheerleading, literally waving the American flag in all their graphics, but we expect TV to be fairly dumb, right? And we expect them to bow their heads, part of the huge conglomerates that they are. At the time, NBC is owned by GE, which is a defense contractor, and it goes on and on and on. The New York Times is supposed to be better than this, but instead what we have here is them saying it once it becomes safe to say it. And John is right, there is a legal and technical definition of torture, and we know that it met it because we prosecuted people for this same exact crime and called it torture before. So it was not in dispute. The only reason it was in dispute is because they started playing the he said, she said games. Republicans say this, and Democrats, of course, say nothing, right? And so the New York Times got scared, and they did what the government wanted them to do, which is Cara's point. And that's the biggest crime of all here. And it goes to Ben's point about context. What did they do? They put Judy Miller's nonsense on page A1, headline after headline, weapons of mass destruction, oh my God, they're coming, mushroom clouds, etc. By the way, they had some decent articles that were buried, and I remember Ben and I covered it as it was happening in page A17 and A27 about, are those tubes really for weapons? And maybe it turns out, no, not really, right? Let alone the fact that they did not put headline after headline saying that Saddam did not attack us on 9/11, as 70% of the country thought. 7 out of 10 people, when we invaded Iraq, thought that Saddam had personally done 9/11. And if you're the paper of record and you were part of that great misinformation tactic, then at least you had the obligation to call what we did afterwards torture when it was clearly torture, but you didn't because you were scared and you bowed your head to the government. So now that it's safe and the president has finally called it torture, and there's a giant CIA report in the Senate Intelligence Committee about CIA saying it did not help, it did not work, and it was torture. Finally, after the government sanctions it, you turn around and say, oh, okay, it was torture. It's not better late than never.
No, it's bullshit. And what I think a lot of people don't understand is the New York Times in this situation historically is the rate limiting step. This is a paper, like you said, it's the paper of record. It's the beginning of the funnel. It's the primary source material. Right. And so much reporting comes out of that. They directly influence what is in the heads of the American public. And that's why this is so gross.
Every news network reads and it starts the day by reading the New York Times. Or during that era, they read Drudge. It's not even a joke.
Yeah, right, that's the sad part.
And he didn't refer to it as torture either.
Yeah, I mean, what a giant pussy. Them, the paper, like what? You can't even. It's 2014, and the legal definition, by the way, that's for lawyers. Journalists don't have to follow that definition. Other journalists got around that definition because they knew what torture was, and you could have said what appears to be torture if it was so difficult for you. There's a lot of ways around that. And they didn't, and they were afraid. And as Cenk said, and as soon as you said, Cenk, who do you think I thought of when you said when it was convenient? Now they're coming out against it. And then instantly I thought of who? Because that is a phrase that we used all the time for Hillary.
I was going to say Chris
who made
Matthews.
the most, whose turn against the Iraq War was like Chris Matthews, was when it was wait, okay, it's the safest thing in the world now. I mean, she had a chance.
By the way, another instance where it was not better late than never.
No, not better late than ever, because she, like the New York Times, had an opportunity to lead and chose not to.
Well, they're supposed to be
the presidency.
Cost of the presidency.
There's supposed to be integrity when it comes to the free press. We don't expect integrity anymore when it comes to our politicians. And we understand that our politicians don't answer to the American people anymore. They answer to big business and corporate interests and all of the lobbyists that are lining their pockets. But the press doesn't. The only thing the press is supposed to answer to is the truth for the people. That is the whole point of having a free press in this country. And it was this one bastion that was left of like, okay, I'm not going to be cynical about this. And thanks, New York Times. That's what you did. You made us all fucking cynical.
Good job.
The sports section still sucks.